You're live.
Good evening, listeners. Welcome to another edition of Socialist Action webcast. My name is Elizabeth Weiss. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, and webcast host. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people, in the place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino, Arawak-speaking people, began arriving here 4,000 years ago, but were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is why the police should be defunded, disarmed, and disbanded. With Rajean Hoilett, prison abolitionist and community organizer, Loretta Fisher of Spring Magazine, and leading Socialist Action members Kurt Young in Mississauga and Corey David in Scarborough. Rajean will speak for about 25 minutes. Loretta, Kurt, and Corey will speak for about 7 each. Then we will take questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the question into the chat column. You may direct your question to any one of the speakers or to all. The speakers can also answer all questions if they wish. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or by giving us a call, 647-986-1917. And now, let's welcome our first speaker. Rajean Hoilett, is a member of the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project, a prisoner justice organization that uses public education, mutual aid, and direct action to promote prison abolition. He works with the Abolition Coalition, a national network that recently launched the Choosing Real Safety campaign. He is also the digital organizer and communications coordinator for the Workers' Action Center, an organization dedicated to improving the lives and working conditions of people in low wage and unstable work. Welcome, Rajean.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you so much to everyone at Socialist Action for holding this place to have a conversation. And thank you so much to all of the folks that are watching now, that will be watching this video. For folks that are watching now, I want this conversation to be as useful, as generative for you folks, and have been invited to share some words, but I know that there are a lot of people with a lot of lived experience and a lot of questions and a lot of things that you want to bring to the table. And so if you want to drop your questions or your thoughts throughout in the chat, I'll also, or in the comment section on YouTube, I'll also continue to pay attention and to look there and try to answer your question or make my contributions here today as relevant as they can be. And so, yeah, thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Rajean. Everyone struggles with the last name. It's just Hoilett. It rhymes like toilet. But I'm really excited to be here and speak with you today about why we need to support the uprising, support the movement that is called for the defunding, the disarming, the disbanding, and really the abolition of policing and all other forms of carceral logics that have led us to these institutions of policing. I think that it is really important that we're having this conversation in a socialist context because really what we are talking about here, this demand to abolish the police is deeply a socialist tradition. It is a socialist demand that we're making. The Ontario budget, for those of us that are organizing here in so-called Ontario, just came out, and Ontario has just allocated $1 billion in 2021 and 2022 to so-called justice infrastructures. So we're thinking about things like policing and courts and prisons. and that is 10 times funding that is currently going to education. And so particularly the system in which we're talking about right now is is draining money from the services that we need within our communities. I think it's maybe a little bit necessary, like on this question of why, to take a few steps backward and really understand what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about police and all of these other systems that are so deeply connected to police. And it is the history of policing is exactly why we're not having a conversation about reform, why we don't believe that reform is possible, especially here in Canada. But really, when we look at any settler states across the world, these institutions of policing and surveillance and criminalization and punishment were created specifically to I mean, first here was created specifically to reinforce this idea between who are owners and who are workers within community, who has direct access to the fruits of our labor and who does not, and to be able to really solidify capitalism as it's starting to form. As Black people successfully call for the abolition of slavery, and our work is no longer sort of directly coerced by employers, police then get used and reformed and reshaped to be able to control Black people, Black communities, Black movement, Black work, Black life, in public space, in private space, and really immediately sort of get uprooted from not just focusing on workers, which at this point don't include Black people. Black people aren't being paid for their work, and so when we when we come into this part of society, policing gets adapted as a tool to be able to continue to control our lives. For folks that have had some introduction to the atrocious, violent colonization of this land, you know that the RCMP specifically was created to be able to police Indigenous peoples on their land, to be able to deny them access to culture, access to religion, access to ceremony, to strip away Indigenous children from their families, to be able to put them in residential school systems. And so, by and large, the police sort of in their inception are here to protect private property and to police and harass and surveillance and criminalize and Black and Indigenous people as a tool of white supremacy. And so we understand policing, and not just the police services, but I'm talking about all of the things that are connected to policing and that make policing the go-to response from the state when we're thinking about how to support people. And so it's because of this history, it is because of this stated purpose of this state institution that we are not interested in conversations about how do we reform the system. We believe the system is working as intended, that it is working well to reinforce white supremacy, working well to uphold settler capitalism and settler colonialism. And so the conversation that we're having in the streets right now is a conversation about dismantling these state structures that we know are harmful, are about the creation, the necessary creation, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, we're working to create a world in which all life is precious. And so that is what these movements are doing. It is not simply a conversation about funding allocations and when people, there's the sort of common meme that's going around in response to defund the police. They're saying defund the police. They don't mean all police, but yes, we mean all police. We mean all of these institutions that are attached to these institutions. Earlier, I mentioned that the funding allocations for police and policing comes at a direct cost to the things that we know we actually need in our communities. When we're thinking about housing for all, when we're thinking about ensuring that all workers have protections in their workplaces, all of these things aren't possible because the priority, the state priority, the belief in the thing that the state is working so hard to be able to preserve in this moment and beyond this moment are these institutions that are harming these communities. And so it's important that we are taking direction from these movements for abolition, that we're supporting these movements for abolition, no matter where we're organizing in. Because if you're organizing in education, if you're a worker organizing, there is somehow a connection between the work that you're doing, the issues that you're facing within your workplace, and the state-sponsored violence that's happening through policing. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about prisons directly. As it was mentioned, I work within the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project. It's saying my microphone is noisy, so hopefully folks can hear me okay. You can give me a thumbs up if you can't hear me. But I work within the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project, and for all of the names that we know of people that the police have killed within our communities, I'm talking about Aisha Hudson, DeAndre Campbell, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Orlando Brown, Jason Collins, Andrew Loku, Jermaine Carby, Abdul Rahman Abdi, so many more people. All of the people that we know that have survived police violence, people like Chantel and Mike, who are leading a revolution out there in Peel. There are so many more people, thousands of more people that we don't know their stories. We don't hear their stories because they weren't tragically killed. Instead, they were sentenced to a slow death and stripped away from their communities and put into cages. Right now, we're seeing over the course of this past year, more than 7,000 COVID cases were attached to prisons and jails. We're seeing widespread outbreaks within our communities. And these are Black people, these are Indigenous people, these are folks who are close to either of those identities that are being uprooted from our communities, that are now being subject to a quick death. If an 85-year-old man just died at the Toronto East Detention Center, why is an 85-year-old man in prison to begin with? Why is anybody in prison to begin with? But specifically, an 85-year-old man gets sick within 3 days, is dead. And so these are, when we're talking about policing, it is comfortable to couch the conversation in standing up for people that we deem to be innocent, standing up for people that we deem to be worthy of movements, worthy of saying their names and printing their names on posters. And we believe that is important. And we believe that it is important that nobody is left behind, because the damage is really done within our communities are these thousands of people, these hundreds of thousands of people around the world that are taken, locked up in cages, because our only imagination that the state has to offer when we're asking for community safety, when we're asking for safety for women who are in domestic violence situations, when we're talking about people who are committing crimes of poverty, when we're talking about people who are using drugs, the only response is then to be able to parachute and helicopter police into our communities. And it is proving to be deadly, which is why people are saying that enough is enough, that we can't sit back and continue to see our people subject to a slow death, subject to a quick death, and subjected to failing institutions that aren't serving our communities. We mentioned that the budget that is going into all of these things are 10 times higher than education funding, and we have kids in school who are being pushed out of their school because there isn't enough resources. I was just talking to a brother who teaches at a school here in downtown, and hopefully his story will come out. But he's supporting students, primarily Black students, at an institution who are not on track to graduate. And he lost his job for spending too much time on the cases that his school has determined are not the people that we need to be wasting time with. There's scarce resources. We can't have a staff person for every single student. And the truth is that we can offer that kind of support for folks. So I'm also seeing like some of the questions. I know I have about like 5 or so minutes before I get cut. So I'll also try to speak to some of the questions. The last question that I saw come up by dinner with Franklin is, what is the first practical step to defunding the process? What do we need to do first to move forward in the struggle? And I think this is often, and I see that this question is is coming from a place of, like, how do we move forward? Where do we go? How do we get out of here? But oftentimes we get asked this question from folks within the state that support the state about, okay, well, if not police, then what? As if the people that are doing this work in community are supposed to, on our volunteer hours, create these institutions that'll better service our communities. And by and large, what abolitionists have been saying around the world is anything is better than what we're receiving with police. What we know that we need to do is make sure that people have access to housing and food, and we can start to take care of some of those basic needs and basic necessities first. What are we doing on the organizing front? We've, the pandemic has led wind and offered energy to movements for mutual aid, pulling off of socialist struggles, pulling from anarchist struggles, calling for communities to create means to take care of each other, to take care of our communities. We at the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project started organizing through a campaign called We Keep Each Other Safe. But really the hope is that we can start to have these conversations about community safety, have these conversations about needs within our community. Some of the things that we've started doing in our organizing, we're hearing from folks that are dealing with mental health crises in their campaign or in their communities. And so we've started to open up spaces where we're talking with each other about how do we deal with suicides in our communities? How do we decrease our own reliability on these systems that we know are gonna show up and try to kill us? I believe there was a man in Ottawa that the police, he woke up 5:30 yesterday morning or 5:30 this morning with police guns pointed at his head. They had entered the wrong house. They'd been conducting a quote-unquote wellness check for somebody that they believe was thinking about suicide, and this was their response. And so we're talking about how do we start to do this work within our own communities to make sure that we are well equipped to be able to minimize the reliance on police within our communities. Seeing some of these other questions too, like all organized crime syndicates, defectors are met with harassment, job instability, remove violence if they come forward about police abuses. Yeah, I think I'm not 100% sure what this question's about. This question about supporting defectors who want to report to the public, but we know that all instances of police violence are then very difficult. Like for all the stories that we do know that exist, there are so many more stories that people are afraid to tell. They're fearing deportation, they're incarcerated, and they're fearing further harassment, or they're out on bail or out on parole, or they're folks that are living within the street community. And so I think like we as people of conscience, as people who are taking time out of our day to come into these conversations or to highlight the stories when they do get told so that more people can see that these stories are getting told, but also not to wait for the tragedies to happen before we have this principled stance. It took George Floyd's murder for, okay, I see that. We have George Floyd's murder that has catapulted this conversation about defunding the police and making it a palatable conversation. But in reality, it's because organizers through Black Lives Matter, as an international movement, have been steadily talking about the need to be able to address police violence, and that need being to defunding, dismantling, and abolishing police wherever they stand. And it's because of that work and that ethic that Black folks, that Indigenous folks have brought to these issues in the past that have led to now what is an open conversation where we can be having this conversation about abolishing the police and defunding the police. There are movements across the world. Here in Canada, we have movements in almost every city in the country talking about defunding the police. If not one or two people, there are full-fledged, well-organized groups of people that are talking about how to have these conversations and how to put pressures on their city councilors. Within 2 days, we at the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project collected 20,000 signatures across the country of people who are trying to organized locally towards their city council last year following George Floyd's murder and Regis Korchinski-Paquette and E.J.S. Chowdhury's murder. Around the world, we're like in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, following them burning down a police station, we saw this defunding of that institution. And as we study what has happened over this last year, we know that the state will do whatever it can to be able to reform or reshape policing, to be able to present it in more palatable ways, to be able to trick us into thinking that the resources that they're putting into meeting our demands are actually meeting our demands. And more often than not, those actions have just bolstered the very violent system that it is that we're trying to address. Here in Toronto, where I live, there's been a move to support mental health workers to be frontline workers with police, and they've quite literally co-opted, community movements, people that are trying to do the work in the community to be able to build these things. They've pulled up those movements, offered them funding, and then made sure that their funding is tied to, like, don't talk about police, don't talk about the fact that you want to defund the police. Those same people that are talking about being first responders are also saying that we also want the police to join us on these calls. And we know when we look at cases like Regis Korchinski-Paquette or E.J.S. Chowdhury, when there are professionals on site that can deal with the situation, along with police, we know who has the power in those situations and who gets listened to, and then who pays those dire consequences. And so we are organizing on this issue because it is life and death, but because the world that it brings about after our organizing is the world that we need, a world in which education funding is priority, a world in which housing is a priority, a world in which we are doing something about poverty, a world in which we are making sure that everybody has access to food, and that world does not exist in the same world in which we pour billions of dollars every single year into policing in cages. So maybe I'll pause there, and I see Elizabeth's eager to jump in.
Elizabeth, you're muted.
No, I'm not eager to jump in. If you have more time, if you have more to say, it's just that we do have a Q&A at the end. We don't answer questions during the presentation. That was just a message I was trying to get through, but that's all. But you have more time if you have more to say.
Oh yeah, no, I'm really eager actually to hear some of the questions and to hear some of the other panelists. And
okay, no problem, no problem. All right, so then we'll move along. Our next speaker is Kurt Young, who is also our producer, and he's a building trades worker, sheet metal worker, Union Local 35. He was the Workers' Action Movement candidate for vice president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, who got 34% of the votes at the November 2019 OFL convention. He is a leading member of Socialist Action. So welcome, Kurt. You have up to 7 minutes.
Hi, everyone. So I'm actually going to repeat some of what Rajean has already said, but I'm going to go into a little more detail. So I would like to start by quoting Omali Yeshitela of the Black Socialist Oharu movement. I was first acquainted with this quote as the introduction to the song by Dead Prez called The Police State. Omali Yeshitela says, "The police becomes necessary in human society only at the juncture in society where it is split between those who have and those who ain't got." The modern police system as we know it was created in the English-speaking world. In all instances of its inception, the police were established to maintain power over an oppressed group. Here in Canada, it was the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who were used to violently contain Indigenous peoples within reservations. In the US, it was initiated in the formation of the slave patrols who were tasked with capturing and returning runaway slaves. In Britain, Sir Robert Peel, former Prime Minister of England and the Home Secretary at the time, chose to import the policies established in the military occupation of Ireland. He implemented them in England as a means of addressing the internal refugee crisis that was brought about by what is known as the Enclosure Acts. In the 18th and 19th centuries, small farmers were dispossessed and driven off the common lands to live a life of misery in the cities. The land was then given to the wealthy and enclosed in fences for the purpose of generating profits. I bring up this history because it spits squarely in the face of the lie Canadian children are subjected to within the school system, that the police are there to protect you. The police are there to protect private property and ensure that second and third class citizens remain within the boundaries established for them by the rich ruling class. This is why, according to the UN report on racial disparity, released in March 2018, in the US, drug use is equal among white and blacks. However, blacks are 5.9 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses than those of their white counterparts. This is why the police are more prevalent in poor and minority neighborhoods than on Wall Street and Bay Street. Here in Peel Region, which is named after Robert Peel, fittingly, the police have been involved in several prominent murders. DeAndre Campbell and Ijaz Chowdhury were two men of color in the midst of a mental health crisis. When their families called 911 for help, instead of a mental health professional showing up, the police were dispatched. And shortly after their arrival on the scene, both men were shot to death. Unsurprisingly, the officer who killed Mr. Campbell was not deemed criminally responsible by the SIU, also the Special Investigations Unit, Ontario's so-called police watchdog. The murder of Ijaz Chowdhury is still under investigation. But this nickname is a farce, as it has been reported that the SIU has laid charges in only 4% of the cases that it has investigated. There have been many studies that have shown that the increased social programs have significant impact on reducing crime, poverty, and increasing upward mobility to the extent that is possible under capitalism. But for the last 40 years, however, all social programs from childcare, education, to healthcare, to welfare have been under attack by the continued progression of neoliberal policies. As social spending is cut and services are privatized and the police budget is increased, the public coffers are plundered by the oligarchy, and the police are there to prevent the masses from forming an organized grassroots opposition. This is why the Occupy movement and the Toronto G20 protests were so violently suppressed. There are many out there that believe that what is needed is police reform, that at the heart of the police system, is inherently good. But as I have demonstrated, it is not just a thin blue line, which is an unspoken policy by police to always support each other, even when they break the law. It is not only just the so-called bad apple, which, if you know the colloquialism, it's a saying, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch.
Sorry, brother. Can you pin your screen? Because some folks in the chat are saying that they can't.
I'm very sorry for that.
I tried to tell you on the screen, but you weren't watching.
Yeah. So,
okay.
Sorry, everyone. I'm a little focused on presenting. But as I was saying, as the colloquialism says, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. So that is to say that once you have one bad apple amongst you, it'll only infect all the members, and eventually you'll all become bad apples. But that's not the only problem. It is the very nature of police that is corrupt. The police are steeped in the violence against the majority at the service of the rich minority. They are diametrically opposed to the interests of the working class of all races and creed. The police and the Canadian military recruit in their own image, so it is no wonder that they attract more than their fair share of bigots and bullies. It is for this reason that Socialist Action demands disarm, defund, and disband the police. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kurt. And so, folks out there listening, thanks for reminding us. We appreciate it. But Kurt is always multitasked as a producer, but now he's also being a speaker. So that's why. Now I see that Loretta is not back. Our speaker, she would have been. She is back. Wonderful. Okay, so she was supposed to be the second speaker, but because she got called away, she's now our third. So welcome back, Loretta. She is a community organizer with the Workers Action Center, a poet, and a member of Spring Magazine Group. So welcome back, Loretta. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I did get to hear some of what Kurt was presenting, and I agree wholeheartedly. So I have the following personal example of calling an ambulance to get my loved one to the hospital. It was kind of an unfortunate experience because the ambulance guys came and they asked me what hospital her doctor was located in, and so I told them. But then they just looked at me and they said, no, they'll bring her to this other hospital that's closer. So I was wondering, like, why ask me where her doctor is and then say, no, they're not going, they're only going to the close. It just made me wonder, like, what did I have to be wearing? What color skin did I have to have for them to actually say, oh, that's where your doctor is. We'll take you where your daughter's doctor is. But no, they said, no, we're not going there. We're going to go to a closer one. And so because of that, they just disregarded my information and told me I had no choice. They brought us where they wanted, where we knew no one, and it took much longer to get help. As a direct result of waiting at this strange hospital, my child ran away. And hospital staff said my only choice was to call the police on her. I wish everyone could get rid of this idea that there's only one number to call. For most Black, Indigenous, and people of color, there's never been one right number to call, since 911 is the crisis number that gets aimed at us, even when we are the ones looking for help. Underlying racism in any of our social services must be rooted out before alternatives can ever be effective. Otherwise, it just remains a rotten setup for any person of color. How can a police service be effective when the majority of citizens aren't even allowed to explain what the crimes against them are? When working class people who are BIPOC try to stand up and tell the authorities what the real crimes against them are, it's not thought of as, oh, let's listen to what's been done against you. It's thought of as, oh, a Black person is complaining, and somehow that seems to be against the law. So when we stand up to say what was wrong, then we are being hurt, targeted, or cheated. And that is the time when we're likely to be brutalized or even killed. We see a lot of BIPOC individuals being suspected of crimes simply for being somewhere that a rich white individual thinks they do not belong. In a Desmond Cole interview I watched, he gives a good example of people in their high-rises seeing homeless people down below and calling the cops to remove these homeless people. So everyone from rich condo dwellers to just regular, maybe lower class people walking their dog in the park believe that it's their right and their privilege to sick the cops on people who they believe are not where they're supposed to be. This is more than an unjust waste of our taxes. It's an absolutely heartless war against the existence of human beings. This system has intentionally impoverished the people that are being removed, that they're trying to remove from tents or stop them from having tiny shelters built for them, and then actually slapping injunctions against against a person who's actually building the shelters for them. So that's why I'm saying that who's deciding what's a crime here? Many police investigations are often based on worst case scenario, biased assumptions about people of color. And if this was not so, then we would have a lot more police arrests of BIPOC without violent incidents, wouldn't we? It would be great to have arrests like the one near the guy near the PM's summer home. It would be nice if that was the norm for BIPOC suspects and perpetrators. Instead, BIPOC suspects receive harsher, deadlier treatment. And I read someone's comment online today who said this is because people of color are just more violent. And if only they would just stop fighting back or stop struggling when arrested if we're not guilty. The poster of that note believes his is a completely true and fair statement. Throughout many decades, I've heard this stated on radio, TV, um, and it's a stereotype, and it's more than a stereotype. It's actually getting us killed. Despite the existence of violent criminals of all different races, our nation broadcasts the violent tendencies of BIPOC only, as if we're the only people who commit crimes. And so our people are afraid of our violent tendencies, whether we're even a criminal or not. And that's why we are not arrested without incident. So it's a setup. Under the current policing system, one portion of the population feels safe and protected, while other portions get painfully targeted. Instead of this bias system, which leads us deeper into racial divides, we need to make a drastic change and back the defund movement to find an equitable system that does not target and marginalize the Black people, disabled people, low-wage workers, deaf people, blind people, immigrants, the working class, someone just trying to get to the hospital. The negative stereotypes of BIPOC actually benefit the ruling class who've been making billions from over-policing in order to add to their industrial prison complex. So of course they would not willingly defund the OPP in light of all that money and power over us. That is why the working class must unite, organize, and empower themselves. We should bring widespread awareness to all embedded systemic bias and then start to move bravely away from this destructive status quo. Let's start to identify what the real crimes are and what they're not. Let's align with others working to design a safer policing system that serves the real victims of the real crimes. I'm wondering, is my time up yet?
1 minute.
Okay. Let's assist prisoners from being overpunished. Let's start now so that if and when a time like this arises again, then even more of us will be better prepared to move toward defunding and disarming this flawed policing system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Loretta. Okay, our next speaker is Corey David, who is a machinist, a poet, a guitar player, and a land back movement supporter. Corey was the Socialist Action candidate in the recent Scarborough Agincourt City by-election. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you. Okay. So I really appreciate what everyone's had to say so far. I'm going to go a bit into the development of police in society and where it starts and how it got to where it is and what we have to do to get rid of it to some degree. So in primitive society, people only created enough for their immediate needs. But as human development moved forward, they produced a surplus, more than what they needed to consume to sustain themselves. And as the surplus grew, a certain section of society became responsible for the management of the surplus. And as they took more and more control over that surplus, they separated themselves from society, creating classes within society. And as they did this, since they were the few and they still needed, the majority of people to continue to work and to produce, they needed another section of society to maintain their power and control. So they privileged a certain section of society above others, both with power and with material means, money, to do so. and that is the modern police. I mean, it may have started out as the military or whatnot, thousands of years ago, but in today's context, that is the police. They are privileged by the ruling class, by the capitalists, to protect the system which benefits them, which gives them sole power over society. And I was watching something today about the state and about the neutrality of the state, and how the neutrality, the supposed neutrality of the state, at least the appearance of it, benefits the ruling class, because it says it's the state is not working for me or for you, it's working for everyone. It is every citizen is equal under the law. I mean, in the current context in North America, I mean not everyone is still a citizen. We still have lots of uh, uh, what's it called, sorry, migrant labor. We have lots of migrant labor. We have lots of refugees. We have people who are not citizens and so are not equal under the law. But as the capitalist system likes to proclaim, all citizens and all peoples are equal under the law. Yet the system is totally developed for the rights of the ruling class, property rights, private property rights. It is not, they say on paper that human rights are guaranteed, but yet we don't find people houses. We have the police throw people out of houses. We have the police destroy people's houses, as Loretta and other people have mentioned, whether they be tents or whatnot. The police will show up to protect a landlord from peaceful protesters who are trying to air their grievances, and those same police will throw people on the street, committing acts of violence and possibly causing them to be victims of social murder. So the police in society are a tool of the oppressors, and it is imperative that we confront that. But we have to educate people before we can get to that point, and that's part of what we're doing in Socialist Action, and what we're doing across these movements, to defund, disarm, and dismantle the police. So where are we now? Well, the police, as was mentioned, they have been reformed to some degree, but it is not to change their function. It is not to stop them from upholding capitalist rule and upholding their own privilege. It is just to appear more palatable, as Rajean put it, which is very well put. There are examples of the RCMP going into First Nations and murdering their dogs so they could not travel and they could not hunt and they could not, live the way they were living. And they were also, most people know now that the RCMP, along with the Catholic Church, went and kidnapped children to take to residential school. They actually kidnapped children. They didn't notify the parents. They just went in there and kidnapped children. So, that wouldn't fly in today's liberal sort of, mainstream context. So the police had to reform. They had to appear, more acceptable to the average person so that they can continue to exist. And so in doing that, they've actually often received more funding. They've expanded themselves, under the guise of being more accountable. These body cameras, for instance, which in calls for the city to defund the police, the mayor of Toronto recommended and eventually passed an increase to the police budget to allow for more body cameras. And as has been made poignant by many people, the body cameras are just because the police and the system, the justice system, does not trust people of colors. It does not, if it was a white person like myself airing a grievance or complaining, I would have a much higher, be much more likely to be listened to. But the police are a racist institution from their inception. That's how they are designed, under the racist colonial system that is Canada. And so it is those people they don't trust. So they say, we'll get body cameras so we can confirm both sides of the story, instead of looking at other evidence or whatnot, or the social plagues or the truth that is blaring in people's faces for them to see. But no, we'll get body cameras. Now what this does is it actually allows the police to select footage that they want to show people. I think of a recent example at 1492 Landback Lane, where the police released a video of Indigenous youth, or Indigenous people, I think they were all relatively young, taking lacrosse sticks and hitting a police car with it that was sitting outside of, I guess, not outside the reservation, but probably outside the Landback location there. And so they just showed that footage, and a lot of people asked them, well, what about the rest of the footage? It was only like a short 30-second clip or whatever, but what happened after that? And it's been documented. They fired rubber bullets and they fired tasers at people. So thinking that body cameras or any kind of police reform is actually for the community or for the public in general is pretty naive. when you look at the entire history and development of the police in this country. I mean, the police anywhere, I would say, are an occupying force, so long as they protect the private property system. They patrol the reservations. They encircle the reservations constantly. And especially when there's a problem, when there's I say a problem, when people resist the system, they increase their numbers and they start checking people on the highway into the reservations and into other unceded territory, like what happened out west in British Columbia, where they wouldn't let media in. Which they say, which is not their policy, but why are the police officers enforcing it if it's not their policy? Why is this not being changed, right? So they will find any excuse, whether it comes to the top or the bottom. But the police as an institution, as a system, this is what they're about. There are individuals who get into the police for what they believe are good reasons. They want to make a difference in the world. They see it as an opportunity to do so. I joined the military for the same reason, and the military, like the police, does no good work. It is purely a destructive force wielded by capital, to benefit the people, the ruling class who wield capital. So that's why it's important to challenge them at every step, because this is not new. This has been going on forever, and they have not changed. This is still the same system that has existed since human society first started to develop. So where to go?
One
from here?
minute.
1 minute. Where to go from here? Well, I think disarming the police should be a no-brainer. The police are constantly involved in violent skirmishes with people who are having mental health problems, who are living homelessly or living rough, or whatnot, having any kind of grievance. So disarm police officers. Stop patrol police officers. Why do we have people on patrol? This is like an occupying army in this place, So I think we really need to push to stop patrolling officers. I don't think that I rode my bike past police officers having a guy up against the wall and holding him there with like 10 police officers around. Why is there a need to continue to hold him against the wall when there are 10 police officers on the scene? Like, it's just ridiculous. So we really need to push for stopping the police. Like, looking at this long term, this is the goal: to abolish police and to organize ourselves as society to protect ourselves, to look after our interests, in common. And so maybe there will be some sort of institution or whatnot for in a transitionary period, if we get to that point, which I believe we will get to that point, that will go after organized crime, and we'll go after sex trafficking, and we'll go after corruption. I mean, that would be ideal, really. But under the capitalist system, there's no way that's going to happen. They can make excuses and try to say they're going to reform or whatnot, but we know that their interests are not going to change. They will continue to gaslight people and to tell them that this is not the reality, and that policing has made a big difference in people's lives. But I think the evidence is quite to the contrary. So defund, dismantle, and abolish the police. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much, Corey. For the Q&A, if you could just hold your mic a little closer, it would be good. Although we could hear you, but be a little better. All right. So thanks to everybody. And now, with the help of our technical producer, we're going to move on to questions from the online audience. And we are going to, in the first round, we will take 3 questions. So over to you, Kurt.
Just give me 1 second as I'm highlighting all of the questions so far. There we go. So our first question comes from Barry Weisletter. He asked, defund, disarm, and disband the police are demands that are very timely but not fully achievable under capitalism. For that reason, we call them transitional demands, which help to link the current awareness to the objective need for socialist transformation of society. What do you think are the main obstacles to DDD of the police? Spencer Roki asked, like all organized crime syndicates, defectors are met with harassment, job instability, or even violence if they come forward about police abuses. Are there any practical strategies we can take to encourage and support defectors who want to report to the public? And I believe he means police defectors. And Dinner with Franklin asks, what is the first practical step in the defunding process? What do we need to do first to forward the struggle?
Okay, so you have the 3 questions are in the chat. Each panelist will have up to 6 minutes to answer all 3 or however many they choose. And the lineup is this: Loretta will be first, then Corey, then Rajean, and then Kurt. So Loretta?
Loretta doesn't seem to be with us at the moment.
Oh, okay. So then we will move on to Corey.
Okay, sure. So Barry's question first. What are the main obstacles to defunding, disarming, and dismantling the police?
Sorry, Corey, could you put your mic even a little closer to your
Is that better?
a little more?
Is that better?
There you go.
All right. What are the main obstacles to the defunding, disarming, and disbanding the police? Well, the police themselves are obviously a huge barrier, but it's also I think the main barrier is really public opinion and public awareness on how important this is. There's a lot of complacency that I see anyways in Toronto, I mean, and more broadly across Canada and across North America when it comes to even working people and their attitudes towards the police and towards these systems of justice, quote unquote. They don't have to deal with it. Like Canada's majority white, right? Like most white people don't have to deal with the police in this context on a daily basis, and a lot of their friends might be police officers. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but my brother-in-law, I guess we're not married, but my sister's boyfriend is a police officer, and I just found out my cousin is thinking about going into policing today. Actually, I just found that out. So people know people in the police, and then they hear their sides of the things. They get a one-sided argument, and this is kind of the constant thing is we look at the media and the way the media arranges things, the mainstream media, I mean, in general. And we constantly hear from police. They're constantly being sourced and cited and interviewed. I mean, so that's a major area in itself is public opinion and how we get around that. And that's why just like organizing just like organizing on the street to not need police, we need to organize to have our own media, which is part of what this is, to be able to reach people and to talk to them, so they're not just constantly being subversed by these police stories of bravery and heroism or whatever, or tragedy or whatnot, and that we have people that are from the other end that are saying what it's like, and that's why it's so great to have Rajean here and the work he does with the prison system. I mean, which is just a terrible system. My uncle, in fact, was a prison guard, and he just got put on permanent leave because he's has post traumatic stress disorder. I mean, and I don't support what he does. I don't support my family or friends being police officers at all, and I made that very clear to them. But this is why it's a terrible system, because it's not just bad for the inmates; it's bad for the staff too. I mean, it's not at all the same. You can't compare them, but it's just you're having people burn out on both ends, and the people who are on the receiving end are getting a lot worse, and we're not hearing from them. We get nothing. People are locked away in jail cells, and they have no opportunity to speak with the outside world about anything. And often they're put there because of these systems that don't take into account reality. They take into account the structures that have been put in place that have been laid out for the operation of these systems, and they keep on, motoring on. So I think that that's one of the main obstacles, is that we have to reach people, and we have to, demonstrate why it's important, why the police are an oppressive force, and why we don't need them, and why we can organize ourselves for a better world. I don't know how much time do I have, Elizabeth?
Kurt?
Hey, Kurt.
4 minutes.
4 minutes,
okay.
Corey.
Okay, lots of time. So to go with the second question about police that want to speak out, or that want to confront what goes on within police organizations. It's hard. We hear about suicides, especially from women who not only have to face the oppressive nature of police, but also have to face the misogyny that goes into that is a big part of them. I mean, as they're an extremely male dominated sector, I guess, or whatnot, institution. So yeah, I mean, we should support people who speak out always. Any whistleblower. I mean, as socialists, as anyone who wants a better world, we should always try to be promoting that people have safe spaces. But it's not always possible, right? And we lose people that are good people that have gotten into something and realized what it was, and then feel like they have no way out or no way to go on with their lives because of how embedded they are within that system. And like the person Spencer Roshi says, it's like organized crime. They don't just let you leave. You can't just go out and speak out. You'll be harassed. You'll be suppressed by these institutions and by their friends. I don't know. It's hard to say. So that's what I should say. That we should just, if we find these people, if these people come forward, that we do stand behind them, and get them to really show what it's like from the inside. Someone who's been there. I don't know what else to say about that exactly. Well, it's so hard because if you look at like the Defante Miller case in Oshawa, where the young man, he was a kid, right, 17 or 18, I think, and he was walking down the street and he was beaten by an off-duty Toronto police officer and his brother with a metal pipe, and then the police showed up there, I think it's Durham, right? The Durham police showed up there. The Defante Miller was basically unconscious on the ground from the report, and his eye was extremely swollen, which he eventually lost. And they totally took the Toronto police officers, Terrio, I can't remember his first name, but they took him verbatim for what happened. They did not ask Defante Miller what happened. I don't think they looked for any witnesses from nearby houses, not that there were any that I know of. And then we learn as this went on that the responders, the police officers, first contacted Michael. I think it's Michael Terrio. I think they first contacted his father, who was part of the police oversight board in Durham, and they told him, which is completely outside the chain of command and completely against protocol. And I believe the father, I think it's Jack or John, has been removed from his post there, but there's been no other repercussions for this. I mean, so we see that these institutions are extremely insulated from observation. I mean, we have so many examples of the police investigating the police, whether it be its own police organization or an outside police organization. I mean, like you said, these are organized crime syndicates. Essentially, they all protect themselves.
30
they all
seconds.
Want to maintain these positions of power. So yeah, I think that it's extremely problematic. It was not one police officer that came out to speak for Defante Miller. It was actually the lawyer looking at the evidence and going to question the police officers that got the Defante Miller defense in the end. Yeah, so I guess I've run out of time, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Corey. Okay, Rajean, 6 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to make good time. So to Barry's question, I think a comment, I think initially about the sort of analysis that abolition or the calls to defund, disarm, disband the police are transitional demands. I would, really, however, it's helpful to think about the things that are happening. But I think as you study abolition, as you get deeper into thinking about abolition, what becomes really clear is that it is a movement of creation. And so, I mean, the demands that we're making are not just to eliminate policing, to eliminate prisons from our community. We're also talking about what we need to create in its place in order to ensure that we have communities that do not need to be policed, In thinking about what are the main obstacles to defunding, dismantling, and disarming the police, I think I would really push back on the sort of idea that most people are apathetic. I think because of my exposure to organizing, the solidarity work that I'm engaged with people across the country, I think really what we are witnessing and what we've witnessed in this last year is a real uprising against police violence, against state violence. People, I think by and large, aren't in a position where they need to be convinced anymore about why police aren't good for our communities. A lot of people have seen it in the stories that, the story that was just shared about Defante Miller, the stories about Andrew Loku, the stories about so many people that we could point to already have captured a lot of people's imagination to say, or captured a lot of people's spirits to say, this is not the kind of society or community that I want to live in when it is so dependent on police. And so I would say, like, we should be clear. The clear obstacle that is standing in our way for moving forward on this particular demand and all abolitionist demands is the state. It is the state at all levels. So I'm talking about like our city councilors. We're talking about the provincial governments, like I just mentioned, who just dumped $1 billion to further policing. We're talking about the federal government. All of these governments that are paying our communities lip service, that are, you know, attempting to use different smoke screens and signals to throw us off their trail, that are attempting to put forward these programs of social workers and mental health workers that'll parachute into our communities that will still work alongside police. You know, there are all of these things that are happening that are attempting to demobilize the call to defund, dismantle, disarm, and abolish the police in its entirety. And so we should be very clear that it is these state apparatuses. And even when they don't look like elected state representatives, you know, the state is really big. We're talking about all of the other institutions that have attached themselves to policing, that make policing their sort of first way to be able to go through the world. And I spoke about needing to fund education earlier. We can't just fund education without recognizing that education, by and large, has functioned to delegitimize Black knowledges, Indigenous knowledges, the knowledges of other people of color, and push them out of their institutions to enact the same sort of criminalization and punishment that we've gotten so used to. I have 2 more minutes. Oh my gosh. Okay, so that's on the first piece. The other sort of significant barriers are police associations. Police associations pretend that they're unions. They're not even, police aren't even workers. But police associations have really done a lot of work in this country to drum up fears about crime, to make situations seem much worse than any empirical evidence is pointing to. And so we have to be wary of police associations. How do we work with people that are our police or the prison guards, or they're working within these institutions that would like to speak out? I think, one, to ensure that we are fighting for good jobs, that we are fighting for jobs that actually benefit our communities, that people can leave and enter and still be able to be an active participant in our communities. I don't have as much sympathy for police officers. You know, I recognize that they're people too, and that they're folks who are making a decision to think about how community safety gets played out for them. But at the end of the day, they're people with guns, they're people supporting and working within an institution that, whatever their personal beliefs are, is continuing to kill people within my community and people within the communities that I live in. I think the one most significant thing that we can do is to make it incredibly uncomfortable to be a police officer or to be a cop, so that people, you know, are already shaking around and being like, oh, I don't want to tell you that my brother-in-law is a police officer. You know, that is a kind of culture that it is going to need to take to be able to say, you know, it is no longer acceptable to sign up to kill and maim and violently harm people within our communities. I'm going to hit on this last piece again, and I'll be very quick.
1 minute.
I feel you. The first practical step to defunding the police is to engage in the struggle. I'm very grateful that we're having this conversation. Like I mentioned earlier, we are beyond the question of why. Now we're at the question of how and what. And so, what are you doing? What can you do? There is nobody who's watching. There's nobody who will watch. There's nobody that you can talk to that does not have a stake or a responsibility in the transformation that we are trying to see in the world right now. And so I say, get up, get out, do the thing. We need you to struggle with us. We need you to struggle in your corner to be able to see the kind of transformation that we need to happen, because it is urgent. Every moment that we sit back and wait and sort of ponder, another person is taken from our communities needlessly. Some people's names we know, others we don't.
Thank you, Rajean. Okay, Kurt, 6 minutes. Unmute yourself, Mr. Producer.
Sorry, again. So I'll try to make this as quick as possible. So to Spencer Roki's question, the thing that we can do to help these police and speak out is to defund the police, because the reason why these individuals are so scared is because of the level of power and impunity that the police have, and once they are have that reduced, um, then they won't be have as much reason to be scared, which then moves into Dennis Franklin's question. The first step I would say is to start funding social programs to empower these communities that have been at the the butt of the gun of the police, who've been oppressed by the police. If we start taking the funding from the police and putting into social programs, putting to education, reforming the education system so that it's based on a more universal perspective on how we got here rather than a Eurocentric perspective. I think that would go a long way, especially with the fact that if you look at how the society's structured, it's not a random chance why Black communities are so poor and why Indigenous communities are so poor. It's because it's a focused effort by those who are in power to impoverish those communities. That's why there is, a payday lender on every corner within poor communities, right? And poor communities are more likely to have predatory lending in even when they're capable of being, receiving, better quality rates for their loans. They end up getting higher rates just because they're minority and expected to not know any better. And what do you think is the main obstacle against defund, disarm, and dismantle the police? It's propaganda system. Since the 1970s, the police have had a strong propaganda system on all of our TVs. We see this constantly, that the police have this image that is constantly being expressed, that they're always putting themselves in the line of duty, in harm's way to protect people, which is actually the furthest from the case. Majority of police never see anything in the realm close to a violent crime or participate in a shootout. Majority of police are what has been said is glorified what do you call it, ticket men. The majority of the time that all they do is hand out citations, and that is predominantly the reason why the people refuse to believe and refuse to consider, is because they're constantly inundated of the idea that it's the police that protect you from crime. In fact, if you actually look at this, the way that the police operate, the police are not designed to prevent crime in any fashion. The police are there to respond once a crime has taken place. And the only way a police will ever be able to prevent crime is
2 minutes.
of great social unrest. And that in those times of preventing crime, the only thing that they're out there to do is protect private property.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Okay, so for our listeners who've noticed that I haven't gone to Loretta, our other panelists, is because Loretta, unfortunately, has had to juggle 2 meetings tonight, and with technicalities in that, she's not online with us at the moment. But as soon as she gets back, we will put her in the lineup to answer questions. So just so people know, that's why I haven't gone to her. Okay, so Kurt, back to you for 3 more questions.
Okay, and so our first question comes from not the other, or no, the other Jonathan. We know that police and prisons are part of the fabric of capitalism. How can we integrate abolition with socialist and anti-capitalist movements? Andrew asked, does more Black people like Devon Clunis in police help in any practical way? And Rob McBean asked, what is the likely outcome in U.S. cities like Minneapolis? Police departments are being disbanded.
Okay, so the 3 questions are in the chat. You each have up to 5 minutes to answer, and the lineup will be Rajean, Kurt and Corey. Rajean?
All great questions. Okay, we know the police reserve. I think seeing abolition as a socialist movement, it's an inherently the things that we are looking for are within the socialist tradition of funding social services, and so these two things aren't separate, which means that any gains that we make within abolition take us closer to the goals that we have as socialists doing this organizing. I think that means that you should attach yourselves to abolitionist organizing. Especially within socialist movements, it's important to just be there on the front lines with people, to be organizing with people, to be organizing in conversation with people, and really make that integration happen. So I don't think that there's really much of a separation to comment on. No Black people in the police doesn't help. It hasn't helped. We here in Toronto, we had Mark Saunders as the police chief. When you have state institutions that are created to kill people, they will often find ways to be able to make that more palatable, to make that more appealing. And one of the first things that they will do is claim diversity and bring in some of our own people to then go into our communities and continue to arrest people. And so it isn't what we're looking for. Some of the things that we ask when we're assessing state actions, we ask, does it offer any material benefit to anybody? Is anybody more safe because Black people are now police officers? The answer is no. Another question that we ask is, does this in any way legitimize the system that we are trying to tear down? Yes, those kind of moves are to make this violence legitimate towards the Black communities that they're being carried out on. So we reject that wholeheartedly. And then the last question from Rob, what is the likely outcome? I think that we're going to see a lot of creativity and creation. We should be wary of any state actions to be able to do what is right. And the organizers in Minneapolis have been very clear and have criticized the actions that the state and the city has taken so far to be able to meet these demands. But so we should know that the state is going to do what they can to reform and reshape policing and reform this form of state power. And communities are going to do what they can to create anew and to envision new worlds. And that sort of experimentation will come with hardships, will come with failures. But it is really important. It's a necessary step in abolition, in the kind of creating that we need to see come out of this world. I know I have 2 more minutes, but I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Rajean. Okay, Kurt?
Okay, so I don't think I have much more to add. Rob's question, I'm not very familiar with the Minneapolis disbanding the police department. I agree wholeheartedly with what Rajean said. For Andrew's question, it only is used to legitimize an illegitimate organization, and so there is no reason for us to support such an act. And for no other, Jonathan, the fact is, as Rajean said, socialism is already integrated into the abolition movement. From the very establishment of socialism, way back during the days of Karl Marx, our ultimate goal within socialism is the abolishment or abolishing the state. And if there is no state, there is no police. And so we are part of that movement. And there's, I don't know how we can further integrate something that is already a core within the socialist movement.
Okay, Corey? 5 minutes?
Yeah, so to go off of that, I mean, looking at socialist projects around the world, as in like socialist states, they all have police forces. And so I think it's something that we have to reckon with, that obviously not the socialist movements that currently, I mean, they probably could not function without some sort of police. But that's the goal of socialism, is to have no state, that's the goal of communism, I should say, which is the end of socialism. When socialism is over, the transitionary period into communism, that we have no state and that we have a classless society. But as we see socialist products around the world, I mean, like from a fairly healthy situation in Cuba to a more deformed situation in China, where it's probably one of the worst police states in the world. We need to make sure that if we do develop systems to protect ourselves as communities and as a society, that we don't that there's no power dynamic. The police do not have power over the rest of society. That they're accountable to society. That they're involved in the democratic decision making of society. If there is some kind of body that will be there to make sure that there is not corruption, that there is not organized crime happening, because these things will go on, and especially if they're I'm sure that already criminals are looking at turning this into an opportunity for themselves and supporting the dismantling of police so that they can have they can take advantage, right? And maybe they can even put themselves up as the police. I mean, we call this the capitalist system organized crime. I mean, because that's what it is. And so there will be bad actors that will always come in. Not always, but there will be bad actors that will come in and try to fill in the vacuum, the power vacuum, if police are abolished. And that's why, as Rajean said, it's incredibly important for communities not to rely on the state, but to make sure that they have procedures in place to protect themselves and protect the communities. So that's what I'll say about that, is in terms of the anti-capitalist. Like the other speakers have mentioned, abolishment is part of the socialist movement. I mean, there are probably tankies or Stalinists or Maoists that think that policing from a socialist perspective is in police oppression against class enemies is important. Not viable, is respectable. Like, it is something that is essential, and I completely disagree. I mean, we need to, if we are going to form a social society, we are going to need to smash capitalism, and that will involve force against capitalists to make sure that they don't try to take over the system again or take over society again and dominate society. So it's undeniable that there will be some violence. I mean, that could be very little in terms of just removing people from positions of power, but it could be, as we've seen through history, it could be a lot different than that. So we need to consider these things while moving forward. But as both speakers have mentioned, it's incredibly important to make sure that this is a decentralized movement, and that we do not put one person or one group of people or whatever in charge of the whole of society and separate them from society. It has to be entirely interwoven with itself, and that sounds hard to do, and I'm sure it is hard to do. But that's really the only way I can see forward, to eventually abolishing police completely, to abolishing any source of force on society. Anyways, so, and then to go on to the more Black people in policing, yeah, I mean, it doesn't make a difference. People were citing that in the RCMP, saying the RCMP is one of the most diverse institutions in Canada, corporations or whatever in Canada. And I mean, it doesn't matter. There's a saying, and I don't think it's racist, but it's like the if the Turk is wrist deep in blood, then the mercenary is then the convert is up to his neck. And that means that if people get into these institutions, then they have to prove themselves because they're an outsider, right? If they're a minority, if they come from that, then often, I'm not saying they all do or whatever. These are individuals. They make their own decisions and they take care of their own actions. But there's a lot of pressure to perform and to be one of the group, right? To be one of the in group. So there's a lot of pressure to do, some pretty heinous stuff to fit in within the police institution. And so more Black people, more people of color, more minorities in policing does not solve any problem. It's just window dressing. It's just a cover up for what's really going on. And as Kurt, I don't know much about what's happening in Minneapolis, unfortunately. But I hope Rajean is right and that they will be creative with their solutions. And I'm glad to hear that they're not looking to the state to provide an answer, and they're providing it themselves, because that is the goal. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Okay, so we're going back to our producer for our last three questions. Go ahead, Kurt.
Okay, so Agnieszka Marzelek asks, how can we get the wider public to see that it is racism at the base of police and military? Krishna asks, what made you change your mind about the military, and did you have support to quit? That is directed at Corey. And Mark Kosatsky asked, Winnipeg had an organization called Cop Watch a few years ago. Have you heard of it? And if so, what is your opinion of Cop Watch?
Okay, so we're going back to our panelists, and you each have up to 5 minutes each. And I do believe Loretta is still not back online. No. Okay, so we're going to start with Corey, and then Rajean, and then Kurt. Unmute
Sure.
yourself.
Thank you. Sure. So I'll start with a question directed at me. I left the military for a couple of reasons. I wasn't there very long, to be honest. I was there about a month. I was pretty young. I was 18. And I mean, there were personal reasons, like I was having relationship issues. But also, when I was in the military, I just felt like a prisoner. I couldn't leave. I couldn't do anything. I was completely subordinate or to my staff, which were not officers, which are non-commissioned members who are your staff. Anyways, so when I left the military, no, I mean, my family does not have a history of military service, so there's no kind of pressure like that to join. Like I said, I joined sort of out of idealism at the time, being very misguided, I would say. And when I left the military, no one gave me a hard time about it, and everyone in my family and friends, we're actually for the most part, we're glad I was no longer in the military. I mean, I don't think because of what we're talking about here in terms of imperialist capitalist violence that they dish out and just the completely subversive nature of the military, but because of the dangers of the military of violence and the risk of death or mutilation or whatever. So I think most people were happy with that. That's sort of like a personal story. But yeah, I would say I left mainly because I just did not want to be part of the system, which is like a friend of mine I was talking about before about joining the military. Kind of like what happened, what Chavez did, trying to get people to join the military and make it more of like a revolutionary institution. I mean, but that's not a good route to take. Maybe in Venezuela or another country that is not an oppressive nature, an imperialist nation like Canada. But definitely not in Canada. There's no possibility of reforming the military for socialist ends until the leadership and the government totally collapse. Like we saw in the Bolshevik Revolution, and actual soldiers, start taking democratic control of themselves, which didn't last very long. But yeah, the military is an oppressive institution, and just like the police force, and that's why I got out of it for the most part. Even if I didn't realize it at the time exactly what those reasons were, that's why I left. I don't know about Cop Watch. I know that there are other organizations that are sort of police accountability organizations, and I think they're great. I'm not sure, maybe there are some that are whatever, bad actors. I don't know, but anyways, I think for the most part, if someone's trying to call out police violence, police harassment, police abuse, whatever, and any of that, I definitely support it. I can't speak directly to Cop Watch, but I've seen others, and they do good work, and it adds to the cause. And I'm glad those people, it's a risk to do that because, police have a lot of power. They have a lot of access to information. They have free time in a lot of ways because their shifts are usually long and they get more days off, so they can harass people, and they can make life hard for people. So it's good that people do this work and stand up even though they may face repression themselves. And then to go back to the first question, how can we get the public to see the racism in the police and military? Well, we'll just we're like things like this, and really just talking to your neighbors and dispelling any myths or any propaganda that the police put out or the state puts out in support of the police, in support of state functions, and in support of the justice system, is really to criticize it and to show why it's racist. You can look at its development through history and to where it is now. I mean, it's very clear once you break it down how racist these organizations are.
1 minute.
That they were designed to be that way. That there's no doubt that they were designed to be that way, and that they have never changed their mandate, since their inception. And they will not change their mandate until the system that needs them collapses or is brought down. So that's what I'll say about that.
Okay. Thank you, Corey. Rajean?
Okay. How do we get the broader public? I think that it's really important that we become, each of us takes it upon ourselves to become better at talking about policing in Canada. There is, if you haven't read Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard, it is an incredible text to be able to work through. Oftentimes when we're talking about this issue, we're either pointed to the States like it's not as bad as it is down south, or or folks can only talk about the things that they've been exposed to through the hyper media of what's happening south of the border. But there are so many well documented examples of police violence and state violence. And in this book specifically, Robin Maynard does a really good job of pulling it all together for us to be able to all work through, but then also just highlights how it is devastating to not just Black people, but to people across the board more broadly. So I would say, read the work that Black folks have done to talk about police violence, get better, get more comfortable at talking about police violence in our communities, so that you can do that work of talking to people at the dinner table, talking to people in your classrooms, talking to people in your workplaces, because it's going to really take an effort that involves all of us. I don't know, like, I've heard about Cop Watch in Winnipeg. I don't really know too much about this particular project, but there are a lot of these same kind of things that are rooted in mutual aid that says we're going to be the watchdog of the police to make sure when people are being arrested in our communities or they're being pulled over in our communities, that there are people that show up to be able to see what's happening and to watch what's happening. There are some really great examples of times that has worked. Dean Spade, an abolitionist that organizes out of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, I believe in Seattle, has done a lot of work compiling a lot of resources under something called the Big Door Brigade. You can read all about these different mutual aid projects like Cop Watches that exist that help to end our reliance on policing and to help to keep our communities safe from policing while they continue to exist. So while I don't know specifically about Cop Watch, I think that's the kind of energy that we need to bring to these projects, to think, what are things that we can do before we're waiting for votes or before we're waiting for elections to pass in which people who have consciences are elected? What things can we do within our community to be able to minimize the participation of the police within our communities? How do we limit those opportunities for them to kill another person or arrest another person within our communities? Yeah, I believe those are all of the questions.
Okay, thank you. Kurt?
Okay, so I'll actually answer Krishna's question as well, because I didn't enroll in the military, but I had actually considered the military seriously, because I myself am a high school dropout, and even though I have a successful career or as a machine adjuster, I wanted to get a job that would pay me considerably more, and so I wanted to become an electrical engineer, and the military was probably my safest bet on getting there. But after working with military reserve, who recounted a story about someone corporal being sent to jail for a year and a half for simply speeding, and gleefully speaking how the military prisons are so much worse than civilian prisons, I said, this is not for me, and the individuals it attracts their mentality is reprehensible to me, so I chose not to do so. To make the wider public alert, know that the racism is at the base of the police. It's just continue to do what we're doing, continue to organize, continue to hold rallies in public, continue to demonstrate, continue to demonstrate the police's own actions, and broadcast it to the world. About the Cop Watch. So Cop Watch was a phenomenon that started some years ago. I think it even started a bit with the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's actually a North American phenomenon, not just in what was it, Winnipeg? But I'm more familiar with it. It's American. It's American manifestation, and it was more of a libertarian perspective. They were not revolutionary. They wanted to document the overreaches of police activity rather than document how police are institutionally designed to oppress others. So, and when Black Lives Matter and other organizations came to speak up against police discriminatory actions, they were, conspicuously silent. So I think we need to have a dialogue with organizations like that so that we can get them
2 minutes
together so that we can effectively counter police violence, but in truth, they are not an institution that will, or an organizations or a loose knit of groups that will ever be fully on board with the concept of defund, disarm, and disbanding of the police.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Okay, folks, we're coming to the end of our webcast. A special thanks to Rajean, Loretta, Corey, and to Kurt, and of course to you, the listening audience. So, and also Kurt in producing the show. So please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. All you need to do is fill out the form, and to do that, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada at gmail.com or just give us a call, 647-986-1917. Once again, if you like the show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next SA webcast will be on Thursday, April 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic, The Struggle for Indigenous Liberation from Colonialism and Capitalism, with Eric Johnson at the Native Center of Toronto and Agnieszka Marzazlik, who is a teacher at Grassy Narrows, Ontario, and Barry Weisletter, Federal Secretary, Socialist Action. So that's next Thursday, April the 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy,